Okay, so today we're going to talk about political values. This is part of the series. We've been talking about ethics so far, and we're now getting on to two sessions on politics before we get on to specific issues of ethics and politics. So this first session on politics will be on focusing on values and ideologies. So generally how we think about politics and political issues. But the second one will focus more on specific dilemmas about how to act in politics. So things like voting and activism and party membership and office holding and so on. So if you can try and leave things like that to the next session, we're talking more about political values in general in this one. So yeah, this is all about applying the middle way. So we've been talking so far about applying the middle way in ethical issues. Politics in some ways is just an extension of that. So in both cases, we're starting with our values, the values we find ourselves with for whatever reason, and working with those values. So our individual starting points are going to vary when it comes to political values, as they do with other kinds of ethical values. That's because of our histories as individuals, but also, of course, because of our cultural starting points. So obviously, I'm going to assume some cultural similarities here because we're all, Anglophone people interested in the middle way. If we're having this discussion in Russia or China, for example, we'd have to have rather different starting points. But okay, so as in ethics, when we're approaching politics, applying the middle way, I think is not about finding one true theory that will explain everything. It's about developing our own understanding of things provisionally, our own judgment provisionally, which means that we're learning from others, but avoiding absolutizing any given view that we encounter. So politics is like ethics, and politics is an aspect of ethics. But I disagree with people who tend to reduce ethics to politics. So we talked about ethics as about stretching our judgment about the conditions we meet. So that word stretch was quite important in the last few sessions. Similarly, I think middle way politics is about stretch again, but particularly in relation to socio-political judgments, group judgments, if you like, and our contributions to those judgments. So the kinds of judgments we make, which are not just about our personal lives, but more about how the whole of society works and how it should work, what we think about that. So politics is obviously a specific and important aspect of ethics, but not all of it. The three approaches to ethics that we talked about in the last three sessions. So we've talked about virtues and consequences and rules. We don't actually, they don't come up primarily when people are discussing politics. So elections aren't fought between the utilitarian party and the virtue ethics party. But they are there in the background. It's other kinds of values, socio-political values, that come to the fore more in our relationships with others. Okay, so in talking about those, in talking about socio-political values, I'm going to make use of the analysis of those values by Jonathan Haidt, who I've talked about in various contexts. So I'm going to share my PowerPoint there, which has a slide listing Jonathan Haidt's analysis of political values. So this comes from a book called The Righteous Mind, which is in 3 parts, and I highly recommend the first 2 parts of it. I strongly disagree with the 3rd part. So it's an interesting mixture as far as I'm concerned. The third part, what I disagree with very briefly in the third part, is that that's where he reduces politics to ethics to politics. But the first two parts, he's got this really helpful analysis of what are the basic values where we get our political thinking, our political motivations from. And he's done a lot of empirical scientific investigation into that, including in different cultural contexts. And he ended up with these 6 values, which are combined in various ways in the political ideologies and the political attitudes that people develop. So these 6 basic values are justice, which you could also call fairness. The one after the opposite is after the slash, so cheating is where you go against justice. Care, which is opposed to harm. Loyalty, which is opposed to betrayal. Authority, which is opposed to subversion. Sanctity or purity, which is opposed to degradation. And liberty, which is opposed to oppression. Okay, so all of these values are, well, they're very basically part of our embodied experience. I think that's maybe the most important point to start with. So having them in some ways is not optional. We all have these values, at least in our immediate social relationships. So if you have friends, then you'll have loyalty. Yeah, so values of loyalty will be important in your relationship to those friends. Particularly if you were brought up in a family with siblings, then you'll get a basic sense of justice, probably from that experience of things being fair, things being divided up fairly, or punishments being fair, and so on. So these values are basic to us, perhaps because of biology in some ways, perhaps because of early conditioning in other ways. It doesn't really matter where they come from ultimately. It's just that we're stuck with them. So in some ways they're kind of baked into our responses, but in other ways they are actually useful to us in maintaining society. So they all relate to conditions that we need to address, at least to some extent. So the care value, for example, we can obviously appreciate in the time of COVID how much caring for others is important as part of our society. Also, something like authority. If you learn anything from an expert of some kind, then you'll give them some authority, at least in that respect. So authority is also important, at least to some extent, in the way that society functions. So repressing any of these values, ignoring them, or thinking that they don't matter, is likely to create a reaction in the longer term, because we're not addressing some conditions that we need to address if we do that. So I think this analysis of values, and it's based in scientific observation, but its implications go beyond that. So the other interesting aspect of Haidt's work is that he found different emphases, different spreads of these values in what he calls liberals and conservatives, using the American terminology there. So in American terms, liberal means centrist or left of centre. It doesn't mean exactly the same as Liberal Democrats, for example, in the UK. And conservative obviously means right of centre, and particularly having some believing in some importance for traditional values, or values that relate to traditional society. So what Haidt found in relating these values to different political persuasions was that all 6 values were found amongst conservatives, but liberals, in the American sense, tended to concentrate on justice, care, and freedom, at least in their political judgments. So I've already mentioned that we all have all of them in some ways, but when we're particularly talking about political judgments, then people towards the left are much more likely to just base their judgments on justice, care, and freedom. And the further you go to the left, the more freedom tends to slip out of the picture, and there's more, socialists will tend to focus more on justice and care specifically. So particularly justice, obviously they're interpreted in the sense of justice in the allocation of resources, not just justice in terms of punishment and reward. So that's kind of a good way of explaining, I think, or putting in the picture the difficulty that people more towards the left tend to have in understanding the political use of values of authority, loyalty, and purity, because they've developed political habits, if you like, which don't include appealing to those values, which really reject those values in political terms. So if you think about an example of authority, say, take the idealization of leaders, take the cult of Churchill, say, in the UK, or take appeals to patriotism, like we find in a lot of the Brexit leaver position, or appeals to religious culture, which you might often get in appeals to sanctity or purity. So very often people on the left find these very difficult to understand or relate to in when people more towards the right appeal to them in their political language. That's because they involve identifying with a particular group, and those more towards the centre or left have learned to separate those specific group values in political judgment from the more globalized liberal standards which they've learned to apply to political issues. So they tend to appeal more to standards like universal human rights, equality before the law, identifying with the whole of humanity without prejudice, and also basic economic status for everyone, a certain amount of economic equality. So if those things start to be important, obviously it's going to make less sense to put a lot of value on a specific group and their interests. So a major factor in developing that perspective seems to be higher education, and that's also part of Haidt's findings, that when people learn to think in that systematic way, maybe in education, maybe in a profession, that's the most likely place where they will develop these political attitudes. Okay, so I'm gonna stop showing that slide for a moment, but let's go back to the where we're left there. So that's an analysis, obviously, but I think of a useful analysis of why we end up with political values of a particular kind, and why particularly there's this gulf of comprehension between what we tend to think of as the left and the right, and that this has become more and more obvious and difficult for us at the moment, but this particularly in America, but also in the UK. So the pressing question is, how can we address that gulf? And I think the middle way has a lot to contribute to that, generally speaking. So see, the main value that we need to emphasize is provisionality of political belief. So if we can de-absolutize that gulf and the values which are used to maintain it, that's going to help. So provisionality is one of the 5 principles of the middle way, which I talked about in previous talks in this series, along with skepticism, incrementality, agnosticism, and integration. So all of those can contribute to our understanding of provisionality of political belief, of being able to adapt beliefs rather than thinking we've got the whole absolute story. But it goes along with, for instance, incrementality. So trying to think of our political priorities as a matter of degree rather than, again, as an absolute, as the total picture. And integration is particularly relevant to politics because we need to be able to overcome conflict in order, particularly in a democratic society, to be able to produce democratic decisions. So in a way, the basic process of overcoming conflict is very basic to the way democracies have to work to run society. So if we're going to try and be provisional, well, that's I think going to make a very positive contribution as a citizen to a democratic society, and so that's why it's vital, I think, to develop those skills and to help others to do so. So we can develop it in ourselves, which is an aspect of middle way practice in general, but I think maybe signaling provisionality sometimes helps other people to be provisional, not always, but it might help. And pressing this a bit, you can also think about trying to help make provisionality a public expectation, in political discussion. That again is a tall order, but I think the more we can have of it, the better. So provisionality is not necessarily the same as pluralism or balance, sort of in BBC sense of balance. It's about enabling dialogue by allowing more than two perspectives to be available. So a polarized discussion very often needs a bit of provisionality in the sense of allowing a variety of different possibilities, including third possibilities that challenge the framing of the issue, where there's a polarized set of positions in place. I think it also involves, particularly in the current situation, thinking about where we get our information. So getting our information from sources that accept the value of provisionality and are provisional as far as possible themselves in the way they get their information. So that's why personally I prefer to rely on, for example, academic information, which has been checked, which to a large extent has some provisionality about it. And also from media outlets which have some sort of effective editorial policies and procedures, to check what they're saying, and are not likely to be under strong vested interests, for example, from a proprietor who is pushing a political standpoint. Then probably most of all, making political judgments on the balance of arguments and evidence. So if we could consider a range of different possibilities and weigh them, as it were, rather than settling on one convincing source or one convincing point of view that we think is the whole answer. So that weighing up, I often feel, is missing from political discourse, but it's pretty crucial. So as I mentioned, that kind of provisionality depends on other aspects of middle way practice. So we can cultivate it for ourselves using the other practices I've talked about in previous talks. So mindfulness, the arts, for example. And that can all help our awareness and our imaginative ability to be provisional. But most obviously, critical thinking is highly relevant to provisionality, particularly in the political realm. So I said a bit about critical thinking in the previous talk about integration of belief, but I'm just going to show you my slide again and move on from Haidt to, yes, so this is a diagram just of my 6 elements of critical thinking. If you want to sort of ask, well, what is critical thinking? What what are the most important skills in it. And as I put in the middle there, it's not just critical thinking, it's also critical feeling. All of those skills are really important in terms of having a provisional political discussion. So just to briefly run through them and how they relate. So assumptions, thinking about or being aware as far as possible of your own assumptions and of other people's. So where are they coming from? What are their starting points? Some understanding of reasoning may be helpful. I think this is often overrated as part of critical thinking, but it can help you to be able to see the connections between the assumptions and where people get to. Context is often very important. So in what context is someone speaking? So if they're speaking in Parliament or in a popular newspaper, say, that context may make a difference to how we understand what they're saying. And that relates to interpretation also. So a lot of unnecessary polarization in political discussion seems to be created by people interpreting opponents in the worst possible way. So charitable interpretation would be a really good starting point there. Thinking, yeah, what the different range of things this person could have meant, and how would it be most helpful to interpret them. Credibility is a big issue at the moment in political discourse. You know, what sources do you believe? And so we get these entrenched conflicts with different sources saying completely different things, and nobody, well, I can say nobody knows who to believe, but certainly some people don't know who to believe. So to deal with that, we need to be able to assess the credibility of the sources. That's the most basic aspect of that I've already mentioned, is to weigh up, not just to find the right source, as it were, but to have some sense also of things like the degree of expertise or the degree of bias involved, or the degree of vested interests in the source that you're using. And then finally, bias and fallacy awareness. So there are all sorts of ways in which people try to take shortcuts in political discourse, often motivated by strong biases. For example, ad hominem argument is incredibly common, you know, attacking your opponent themselves rather than what they're saying, as a distraction, as a kind of shortcut to winning. So if we can become familiar with some of those biases and try and avoid them, I think that's a crucial aspect of trying to bring provisionality to political discussion. Okay, so that's just a little bit about critical thinking. Now, so I think these skills put together, particularly the critical thinking, can help us to select the most helpful elements from the different political views that we encounter, regardless of their ideological associations. Yeah, so we need to be open to learning from people who have different ideological labels stuck on them. But of course, there are also realistic judgments to be made. I mean, how long do you spend listening to somebody who you probably know are just going to say these sorts of things? And, so broadly, in terms of the middle way, there isn't a true ideology, but there are more and less helpful approaches in different contexts. So that means, of course, in terms of the discussions we may have, and indeed what I might say, you could be sincerely trying to apply the middle way, but because of your different starting points, you could disagree with me or you could disagree with anybody else involved in the discussion. So just to finish off, I'm going to just say a little bit about my own approaches to politics. And I just want to make it clear that this is an illustration, so of the ways that I have tried to use the middle way in the ways I think about politics and where it's taken me. Yeah? So it's not in any way an attempt to prescribe what the middle way means to you. So my own starting point, my background politically is very much liberal in the British sense of centrist, which my parents were very much. And the more I started to think about the middle way, the more I've encountered some sympathies with what you might call conservatism with a small c, or what you might call Burkean conservatism, because that's basically recognizing all 6 values. So there are some basic ways in which you might expect that adopting the middle way approach might make you conservative in that very basic way, but I need to stress that's got almost nothing to do with capital C conservatism as it currently exists. Writing in the 18th century, Edmund Burke responded to the absolutism of the French revolutionaries by pointing out all the different ways in which successful political policy depending on actually having a spread of values, lots of different ways of doing things, not simply one answer that you impose through revolution. Yes, so that's one kind of conservatism I can sympathize with, but I very much doubt whether the right-wing populists of today should really be called conservatives, actually, should be dignified with that title. But personally then, weighing up the relative importance of the issues of today, the responses and the evidence, I think that there are 2 major connected problems which will come up in our discussions in the next few sessions. So climate change is one of them. Associated issues of economic injustice are another one. So contingently, those determine my political priorities and determine my votes and my support. So that's why I tend to vote on the left, because I think those are the urgent issues, and the left generally, and Greens particularly, are addressing those issues. Not because I have a sort of permanent commitment or an absolute commitment to those ideologies. I'm also very concerned at the distortion of the political landscape by the interests of the super rich through media ownership and social media manipulation of the whole discussion. And that really is very relevant to the middle way, because it involves absolutization as a shortcut. So if you get some people obsessed with one particular issue and taking one particular interpretation of it, for example, something like a big fuss about cancel culture or something like this, then you can effectively distract people from being able to weigh up the issues and actually see which are the most important issues that affect their lives. So the middle way here can be of, I think, of great use. It does not imply neutrality or compromise. It involves, developing political judgments that are based on evidence and experience rather than dogma. And I think that's what we need for an effective long-term response to the political crises we're in. Much more effective long-term response than just swinging to the opposite, absolutization, which is always the temptation. Okay, I've gone on for longer than I should have done there, but it's an issue that's worth expatiating on a bit, I think. So let's have a bit of time for questions, maybe 10 minutes for questions now, and we'll also, this time we will have a plenary after the breakout discussions as well. Okay, but any immediate questions or responses?
Just to pick up your last point, really, one of the difficulties about the provisionality notion within our accepted political system, and I accept that's not the only political system we can have, is that the way our system works is the only way to influence our system or to gain traction in our system is to commit to one or other, or maybe one or other of three or four extremes. In other words, there is a degree. You said I can then take it on an individual expedient basis of the most important issues. Yes, that's fine. But actually, in order to gain any kind of influence, and ultimately for that group of people to gain any kind of influence, what they need is not people making provisional judgments. What they need is a kind of commitment in order to get power to make change. Because the one thing that this discussion hasn't mentioned is, politics is the exercise of power. It is the exercise of power in a given context, yes, but it is to do with getting things done as well as making decisions about ethics.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose technically I'd say government is about the exercise of power, but politics is more a discussion about how we should govern. But yeah, so there's trade-off, isn't there? That in order to realistically get into a position where power can be exercised, where you can actually make a difference to any extent, then commitment is required. And I'm not sure politics is exceptional in that respect, actually. You can say that about other things as well. Like, I know, learning a foreign language, you'll get more out of it if you put more time into it, if you're committed to it. I don't think that it doesn't require our commitments to be absolute, but there's certainly a practical argument for being committed to a particular political campaign, which will involve working with people who might have absolute views on that topic, but yeah, seeing that contingently as a way forward in political realm. Yeah, I mean, that relates to some of the dilemmas I'm planning to talk about in the next session, sort of practical dilemmas. But yeah, this basically, we need a middle way in navigating them, I think. Any other thoughts?
I had a thought, Robert.
Yeah.
Just arising from something I was looking at on probably New York Times, I can't quite remember today, and that online discussion tends towards extremes. It gave a lot of examples of A, B, and C individuals who'd started off with blogging and posting various mild-mannered ideas and things and not getting many views. And then they're discovering that their views shot up when they started going towards an extreme. So there's a tendency towards almost a self-feeding tendency towards volatile extremes in online interaction. And it listed examples of how these viewing figures of these people ramped up suddenly when they're into these very hot, very polarized kind of issues and territories. And they seem to naturally kind of turn themselves into people, and that's particularly true of conspiracy type people. And they just feed on this popularity, which feeds itself. And one definition of populism I saw was people are popular because they're popular. I mean, other people like them because they're liked a lot, and people just join that kind of bandwagon. It's not a question really, it's just a thought. I mean, you stimulated that thought from that idea of monomania, obsession with something, which seems very relevant today.
Yeah, well, I mean, that relates very much to reinforcing feedback loops from systems theory, which is something I use a lot in explaining absolutization, the way in which we tend to get into reinforcing cycles of repeating and proliferating the same kinds of ideas again and again, and that that obviously operates socially, and social media in some ways accentuates that tendency.
Yes, and as you say, the other thought was, as you say, people don't then tend towards weighing things up, one thing against another, so the proportionality drops out of the whole equation, or any sort of sense of seeing things in fractional terms, or weighing up a proportion of this and a proportion of that. And that's particularly true in the climate change debate. People can't get their heads around it when it's a sort of a probability of this or that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Okay. Bridget, did you still want to come in there?
I just wanted to, one of the big dilemmas I've had since I lived in Zimbabwe and Mugabe started all his antics, and he said something that shocked me to the core, was politics is war. Mm. And he systematically went about bombing and destroying the opposition. And ever since then, it was like my eyes got opened, and I noticed a little bit going on with what Jaya was saying, that when you see people taking a middle way approach, they're not really listened to in politics. The extremists are, and therefore it's created an immense dilemma in me about politics. So that was really the question.
Yeah, that's a very good question, isn't it?
Or the comment, really. I don't know, both.
Yeah, yeah. Barry, do you want to come in there?
Yeah, I think it's also important to point out when we're talking about social media accentuating polarized debate, it's actually very deliberate from the social media outlets. They have actually algorithms that seek out these polarized debates and promote them more. It's not. The debate was going a little bit like that just happens by default when people it's really promoted by social media. That's how it's really helped along in its way, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, so there are many ways systems are set up to produce more polarization, aren't there? So whether you're thinking in terms of social media or in terms of the first past the post system in the US and the UK in the elections, or in terms of the layout of the House of Commons, facing each other in adversarial fashion. So these are all things we have to work with, I think, and it will be nice to change the system, but we can't just, there's a sort of idealistic temptation, isn't there, to just say, oh, if only the system would change, then we could be more provisional. But actually, we can't wait that long. We just have to make the best with the conditions we're with. But we can also obviously campaign to help change those conditions, so that those tendencies to produce more polarization are dealt with, and campaign to try and get people to give that more priority for long-term change.
Sure, but as you said earlier, it is a tall order. Even when you think someone, like an organisation like the BBC that, is arguably somewhat more objective than the other outlets. That, if you think of the Today programme, how they just almost put two sides like pit bulls against it. They very rarely bring someone in that's with the idea of nuance, or it seems endemic in our debating culture to pit two sides against each other.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the day I will have a little celebration is if I ever hear a political journalist, say on Question Time or something like that, picking up an ad hominem and saying to a politician, actually, that's not acceptable. You can't just attack the other guy for who he is. You need to actually give a substantive argument here. But that really doesn't happen very much. I mean, there's certain places in obviously, if you look at more specialized media, where it might start happening, but not in the mainstream very much. Yeah. I mean, one place, yeah, if you're talking about the BBC, the adversarial politics programs, you know, rarely do anything to integrate, in my experience. But one program I think Jim's a fan as well is More or Less, which deals with statistics, and there he really investigates the justification for the use of the statistics. You know, it gets much further with it. So there are things that organisations like the BBC do to address these kinds of polarisation problems in some places. Anyway, perhaps we better stop there for now. I will stop the recording for now. So, any questions or comments coming back from your discussions?
It was good that you pulled us back, because Barry and Howard had just started talking about Manchester United. So I thought that was actually a very good juncture to come back.
Okay. So presumably there was a relevant point there before you diverged onto Manchester United.
Yeah, we were actually talking about tribes. We were talking about tribalism within politics, and you know, middle way approach to sort of, and actually just sort of picking up on some of the things that you were saying, Robert, about you know, the ubiquity of ad hominem attacks within politics, and recognizing that that is actually kind of almost like a feature of tribalism, that, you know, you vote for your man who heads up the tribe rather than policies as such, and that you know, how we can sort of use the middle way approach as a sort of an antidote to some of our sort of evolutionary vulnerabilities, if you like. So yeah, no, there was plenty of relevant discussion. It wasn't just Man U.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So that probably helps to account for the ubiquity of ad hominem attacks, doesn't it? That if people are thinking so much in terms of personalities, then it's natural to use the personality as a distraction.
I think the other point Julian was making, that's how much perhaps we take our political institutions for granted, and how difficult it is to actually impose democracy on, you know, you gave the example of a place like Afghanistan, somewhere like that, where you know, it's something that has developed over centuries. You can't just suddenly impose these set of values overnight, or you know, or we're talking about how colonialism just would, or geopolitics, how you just draw a line and say, well, between a tribal group, and just think, well, now you have to do it this way, but we've never done this, you know. So there's but the main point for me was what Julian was saying, is that you know, this is really precious what we have, and you know, how much we take it for granted, despite all its flaws.
Yeah, yeah, and then there's also an issue of incrementality there, isn't there, in the attempts by democracies, particularly the US, to make other countries become democratic, like the Iraq War, and the way in which that tends to fail because of a lack of incrementality, of addressing the in-between states between the desired outcome and the actual state of affairs. Yeah. Okay. Anything else? What about from the Midlands group? What sort of ideas were coming up there? Anything you want to bring back?
Was that us, Jim? I can't remember. Is it we the Midlands?
Yes, we're the Midlands. Yeah.
I don't. Okay. Well, we ended up on a similar note, about a lot of people seem to be trying to rub it in about how free and how lucky we are, almost Panglossian. And yet I get a bit suspicious. You know, I think, you know, it is true. There are countries that are in far more worse states politically, I guess, with totalitarianism and so on. But I don't know. I somehow get a bit suspicious of people who seem obsessed about how this freedom is our birthright. The what I call anarcho-capitalists seizing power at the moment seem to hammer on about this freedom, about liberty is the one thing they're obsessive about, and that getting rid of rules and governments and regulations has actually led to this Brexit situation where things are getting more complicated. There's got to be more rules and regulations. So these the monomaniac type people who obsess about something like liberty, I get a bit suspicious of that. And there's a danger when we focus too much on how well off and how lucky we are.
Yeah, there's a lot one could say about the impacts of absolutization and if you take freedom, for example, as the thing you absolutize, then you've got to choose one kind of freedom as well, because if you choose one kind of one person's freedom or one group's freedom, then other people's freedom is going to be interfered with. So the neoliberal tendency seems to be to emphasize market freedom rather than other kinds of freedom, such as human rights. So there'll always be some kind of kickback, it seems, when you absolutize any value, not just in terms of that value against the others, but also in relation to the different interpretations of that value and the different applications of that value. Julian,
I just wanted to clarify. I didn't want you to think, Vijaya, that there was any sort of complacency in some of the comments that we were making about.
No.
On the contrary, it's like it's recognizing just how fragile these systems are, and that that's the problem with I think you made reference to anarchism in various guises, is the fact that freedom doesn't spontaneously arrive from a lack of rules. Freedom comes out of a plethora of rules and institutions and checks and balances.
Yes. Yeah.
And responsibilities.
So that's another point that emerges, isn't it? That an integrated freedom, say, is much more effective with the other values included. You could say the same about justice. If you want justice to actually work, then you need a degree of freedom as well, and you need care and some degree of authority and so on. So it's the interdependence of those elements that we find in our basic experience. I mean, perhaps wondering, Mark, would you like to explain to everyone what you were just saying about dealing with people who are immersed in conspiracy theories? Because I think that was a good point to move back.
Yeah, well, we were discussing in our group, or at least what I remember most is about the need to find common ground through one's own provisional thinking. And then if you can connect, like with a family member, with someone, that you have some relationship to, or just focus on the common problem that needs to be addressed with some sense of shared value, rather than confronting someone, for their conspiracy theory or way of thinking is completely wrong, and being oppositional and trying to win the argument, because that can really backfire. So I think the provisionality within one's own thinking helps to understand the other perspective, and then maybe look for some common ground.
Yeah, that relates to embodiment, doesn't it? That our ability to be provisional in some ways depends on us being able to connect with our more basic experiences. So like if your brother has got sucked into QAnon or something, then at least you can talk to him about your experiences as children, and that's kind of a starting point for maybe branching out into something a little more demanding gradually.
There's a member, an American member, Mark, called Susan Averbach, who she's very concerned about the polarization in the US, and she joins a weekly meeting with people who are specifically from the other side of the political divide, to do exactly what you're saying. They try to find topics of common ground. They try to basically find their humanity beyond their these values, and their own personal values, and trying to find values that they share.
It's After Dinner Conversations, isn't it?
That's it. That's the name. Yeah. Have you heard of it, Mark?
No, what's it called again?
After Dinner Conversations.
Oh, okay.
And it sounds quite relaxed, doesn't it? But it sounds as though it does have a purpose as well, a goal. Okay. Any other thoughts anyone wants to bring back from the group discussion?
Well, I remember we also were discussing the benefits of homogeneity in Finland, in the Finnish parliament, and how in the UK and the US we're struggling with diversity and how to respect it, but also how that can lead to splintering and radicalization.
Yeah, so that can help provide a model, really, concept for integration or an integrative approach to politics that it seems to have been done better in some ways in Scandinavia.
Yeah, except that homogenization is something that can be enforced historically in violent ways, like in China right now, for example.
Yeah. So it requires certain conditions to get going, and maybe is in some ways limited by those conditions.
Switzerland has a very interesting system where you would hardly know who's prime minister because it changes so often. So that's quite interesting.
So
and they have the Canton System as well, don't they? Where they're quite localized within. Well, I suppose it's like states in the US, perhaps. But
yeah, we're facing a problem with our localized governments now, especially dealing with the pandemic. So there can be benefit to that, but also problems.
Yeah, in the UK, people talk about postcode lotteries, which is the randomness of what you get depending on your local government. Yeah. Okay, perhaps I'll just stop the recording there.